Welcome back. An instrumentalist who cannot be overlooked is Kermit Moore, the first black cellist of distinction and one of the founding members of the Symphony of the New World. He worked and performed with many of the world's finest orchestras.
Oh, Kermit Moore, I've known his work since he was a student at the Cleveland Institute of Music, and he is an extraordinary musician. He is a fine composer. He has phenomenal musicianship, and so he can both write music and play it. He has marvelous taste. He has a wonderful cultural background, which is very important too.
One of the most vocal artists for the struggle of the black musician was pianist Natalie Hunderis. This carried a lot of weight since she was unquestionably the most internationally recognized black female pianist. She was one of the first to commonly appear on network television and to be represented by a major management agency when she was taken on in the 50s by Columbia artists.
Natalie Hunderis was a very special friend of mine. Her real name was Natalie Henderson. She was born Natalie Henderson, and Madame Olga Samarov decided that she should come in by way of Latin America and be an exotic performer, and that she might have a better chance for a career, so she changed her name to Natalie Hunderis. But Natalie and her mother and the whole, they came out of the Oberlin experience. When you went to Oberlin, and when you were people of the middle class, and you got this wonderful background, you were supposed to do something to, quote, uplift the race. And certainly they were people who were very proud of being people of color, and they weren't going to have any parts of it. But she did maintain the name, but not in any way try to pawn herself off as a Latin American performer.
A groundbreaking event took place on January 31st, 1963, when pianist Andre Watts appeared on the stage of the Philharmonic Hall to perform with the New York Philharmonic. When the scheduled solo pianist fell ill and couldn't perform, Leonard Bernstein replaced him with 16-year-old Andre Watts. The event proved to be monumental for both sides. Critics couldn't stop raving over Watts' talent, and Bernstein was credited with making one of the best decisions of his career. To this day, Andre Watts is one of the most highly paid concert pianists of any race.
Andre Watts would not have had the kind of career, I don't think, if it hadn't been for Lenny Bernstein hearing him and taking a chance on him and exploiting him, really, is what he did, because it was to his advantage also to bring out a little boy with this kind of, a young man with this kind of talent.
There are many other instrumentalists besides the ones we have discussed who have achieved distinction in the world of classical music. The success of the musicians we spoke with was driven by the pure love of music, a devotion which begins in many different ways.
In our house, when I was growing up, I heard Caruso and Lehman and all the great opera singers on records. And later on in junior high school, we listened to the Cleveland Orchestra on a regular basis.
Simply because I saw people doing it, and it seemed like an interesting thing to do. The fact that everybody doing it seemed to be a white male was something that did not register at the time.
Well, I got interested in music through the public school system. When I was in the 4th grade, I believe, I was given a recorder or a song flute. And then by my 5th year, I had the option of taking a wind or a string instrument. And actually, I chose to play violin.
Music first became a part of my life I heard music being played by one of our neighbors who used to take piano lessons. And they were studying to be a concert pianist. And so I used to hear Beethoven, Mozart, and different types of music coming from next door. And I was very inquisitive about it. And I asked them, could I come over to listen to the lesson? And they said, sure, you know, as long as you're quiet.
My parents took me to concerts at a very young age. And so I heard classical music. There was an old movie with Liberace in which he played a concert pianist. that had a strong influence on me. And the other influence was seeing Andre Watts at 16 make his debut with the New York Philharmonic.
Well, my parents always took me to orchestra concerts, and my dad listened to classical music a lot, and it's always been around. And I think with piano having kind of a classical beginning with things, and trumpet also having a classical beginning, I just kind of felt more comfortable going in that direction as opposed to something else.
The church was often the first exposure to formal music.
My family was very musical, and my father was a minister, so often we sang religious music. I had an older sister who played in the church and became united with jazz and things like that, so music was always a part of my life.
Playing hymns on Sunday, playing folks, and having them sing. This was a communal thing.
I began by singing in my grandmother's church choir right here in Philadelphia, and she said, "Get up there and sing." So that was my earliest musical experience, but in terms of formal training, I didn't really begin until junior high school.
It is a fact that music has played a very important part, particularly in the church. The directors of music are very well trained and very European classical music oriented. So consequently, great music was heard in many, many churches, even some very small churches, really the great masterpieces and some things that were not necessarily masterpieces. And they also provided some of them composed. So there you got people who were composing especially for the church, and then all those churches had recitals of their soloists, and outside people would come in for fundraising for various things, and they found that there was a large public for that.
It's not so surprising that the works of many black composers successfully merge spiritual and classical music. You will hear what I mean in this piece titled Troubled Water by Margaret Bonds. We have to take a brief break, but when we continue, we'll take a look at the future of blacks in classical music. So what does the future appear to hold in the world of symphonic music for young black musicians? For a few, including Andre Raphael Smith, the journey looks bright. As a student at the prestigious Curtis Institute, located on Philadelphia's affluent Rittenhouse Square, Andre Raphael Smith dreamt of a career conducting a world-class orchestra. Today, he is fulfilling that dream as assistant conductor with one of the world's finest, the Philadelphia Orchestra. Certainly no small feat.
Well, it actually goes way back to my days at Curtis, when I used to come to the Academy of Music and to listen to Riccardo Muti's rehearsals with the orchestra. And incidentally, at that time, my present music director, Wolfgang Sawallisch, was also coming and guest conducting a great deal, so I also heard him. But at that time, it was really a dream to be able to work with an orchestra like that. And so I would constantly go to those rehearsals, and I learned so much from just being around the orchestra and listening to the orchestra. Earlier last year, I guess I would say, they invited me to an audition here with the Philadelphia Orchestra. in which there was a very large pool of applicants. And they selected 16 of us to come to an audition here in Philadelphia with the orchestra. The preliminary audition was with the Curtis Institute of Music Orchestra, and the finals were with the Philadelphia Orchestra the next morning at the Academy. And immediately at that final audition, there was a rapport between the orchestra and I. There was something that clicked. And that's always nice when that happens as a musician, especially with an orchestra as great as this one.
And, says Smith, he was fortunate to have not encountered any discouragement that was necessarily related to his being black.
I think there were certainly people who were worried about what would happen. And I think it's because it's a path which few blacks had actually blazed before. It was sort of a new road and something different, you know, when I was coming up. But I wouldn't really say discouraged me. I think it's more a matter of concern, and perhaps rightfully so.
Jonathan Holland, a composition student at the Curtis Institute, also feels lucky to have bypassed many of the racial obstacles of his predecessors, but realizes the challenges before him.
Well, I'd like to make a living as a composer, which is pretty much impossible. I'm sure I'll be doing some teaching along the way, possibly conducting, I don't know, but I would just like to focus on composition, at least at this point. Who knows what will happen.
Fortunately, musicians today are not so easily categorized as they once were.
There's almost no such thing as a classical musician or a jazz musician. You're a musician, and you're trained, for instance, Duke Ellington was trained on classical piano. But then he played jazz, and he composed jazz. So any musician whose worth is salt at all plays everything. Plays classical, plays studio music, studio work, plays maybe rock and roll, whatever the job consists of.
The younger musicians I spoke with often named jazz musicians as the ones who most influenced their careers.
Most of my influences in terms of the general sort of music that I listened to or I grew up with were more jazz-oriented than classical. I think that also helped me a great deal as I started to deal with works which were classically written but involved jazz. So some of those people might be people like Oscar Peterson or Wynton Marsalis or people of that nature.
Hubert Laws was one of my favorite flutists. Quincy Jones, I enjoyed his music. Also, there was another gentleman by the name of Herbie Mann who was playing at the Newport Jazz Festival and had done some recordings with Hubert Laws on the Atlantic label. So I was, you know, they were very big role models and mentors.
Orchestras in many cities are trying to attract a more culturally diverse audience by featuring more minority musicians and programs of black composers.
I think it bodes very well not only for this orchestra, but for the profession in general. I think that we need young messengers in terms of the classical music profession. We're at a very dangerous time, a time when, of course, funding for the arts is being cut, and people in general don't come to symphony orchestra concerts as much as we'd like. So it behooves people like myself and my generation of artists to really be the messengers in terms of what classical music has to offer to the general audience.
Violinist Sanford Allen views the limited guest appearances and the special occasion concerts given at times like during Black History Month as having little impact in encouraging overall minority participation.
Any musician who functions in the music business understands that the ball game is really the subscription concerts, and that's where the black soloists need to turn up, and that's where the black composers and the women need to be programmed, not simply in a concert at a women's college or a concert in Watts. Those should be adjuncts, but not the entire program. And I think that's an issue that's not really been addressed.
I would question more why aren't black musicians not taking up the instruments in the first place? And I have a feeling that it has to do with the public school system, with the lack of funding. As I said to you earlier, when I was first starting out as a musician, I had the option of playing a string instrument or a wind instrument. And now I think many of the music programs have been cut, unfortunately.
What's most gratifying for me is whenever I go into a school and I see the reaction on the kids' faces, not only when they encounter me for the first time, but when we do various musical exercises or they hear the orchestra for the first time. All of these things are something very special that these encounters will stay with them. There'll be lasting impressions that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives.
Thanks for joining us for our special two-part series, Classically Black. And I'd also like to thank concert pianist, Mr. Richard Alston. For Another View, I'm Karen Smyles.